The helicopter is still half a mile out when the four men hear it. They've been waiting in the darkness for 6 hours, pressed flat against the jungle floor, watching the tree line where 12 North Vietnamese soldiers walked past at dusk without spotting them. Now the Huey's rotors are cutting through the humid air, and in 90 seconds they'll either be climbing a rope ladder to safety or dying in a crossfire they cannot win. This is what it meant to be a LURP. The men who did this work weren't special forces. They weren't elite warriors selected from the top 1% of military candidates. They were infantry volunteers, ordinary soldiers who raised their hands when the call went out for men willing to accept missions that defied reasonable odds of survival. The Army called their units provisional, which meant unofficial, off the books, operating in a bureaucratic gray zone while performing some of the most dangerous work of the entire war. 4 men against the jungle. 4 men against an army. This is their story. Consider the mathematics of what they accepted. The standard infantry company numbered over 100 soldiers. It operated with artillery support, air cover, medevac helicopters on standby, and quick reaction forces ready to reinforce. The LURP team had 4 men, 1 radio, and whatever ammunition they could carry. They operated beyond artillery range, beyond reliable radio contact, in territory where the enemy moved freely in company and battalion strength. The odds weren't unfavorable, they were absurd. Yet men volunteered. They raised their hands, knowing exactly what they were agreeing to, and they kept volunteering mission after mission until they rotated home or didn't come back at all. Understanding why requires understanding what these units offered that regular infantry couldn't: control over your own survival. In a line company, your life depended on decisions made by officers you might not trust, surrounded by soldiers who might panic, following orders that might be wrong. In a LURP team, every man had input, every man had agency. If someone seemed unsafe, you could refuse to patrol with them. The team's survival depended on its weakest member, so weak members weren't tolerated. This created bonds that transcended ordinary military camaraderie. Men who shared patrol after patrol became closer than brothers, closer than most families. They learned each other's breathing patterns, could identify teammates by sound alone, developed a wordless communication that needed no radio. When one man made a decision in the field, the others followed without question, because they had already established, through dozens of previous choices, that they could trust each other's judgment absolutely. The alternative was death. The idea made sense on paper. By 1966, American forces in Vietnam faced a fundamental intelligence problem. The enemy didn't mass in formations that could be photographed from aircraft. They moved through triple canopy jungle, along trails invisible from the air, staging from base camps hidden so deep in the wilderness that conventional patrols never found them. The solution was to send small teams into that wilderness, teams light enough to move without detection, trained well enough to survive on their own, and brave enough to operate where no help could reach them. The first LURP platoons formed from whatever volunteers the brigade commanders could find. There was no official training program, no established doctrine, no standardized equipment. Everything had to be improvised. Teams scrounged indigenous rucksacks because American packs were too heavy. They taped their weapons with green fabric to eliminate shine and rattle. They studied captured enemy documents to learn how the other side moved and fought. What they lacked in formal preparation, they compensated for with nerve. A typical team numbered 4 men: point, team leader, radio man, and tail gunner. Every position was critical. Losing one man meant losing 25% of your firepower, 25% of your eyes and ears, 25% of your chances of making it home. There were no replacements waiting in reserve. There was no one coming to help if things went wrong. The missions began with helicopters. Pilots flew low, treetop level, sometimes lower, to mask the sound of their approach. The technique was called nap of the earth flying, and it required a particular kind of courage from aviators who knew that a single tree branch could bring down their aircraft. When they reached the insertion point, they didn't land. They hovered just above the canopy while the team jumped or rappelled into darkness below. Then the helicopter was gone, and the silence closed in. The first minutes after insertion were the most dangerous. The team lay motionless where they landed, listening for any indication that their arrival had been observed. The enemy understood helicopter operations. They knew what a slick hovering over the canopy meant, and they positioned watchers along likely insertion routes. If those watchers reported the drop, NVA soldiers would be converging on the position within minutes, following the sound signature to its source. So the team waited. 5 minutes, 10, sometimes 20, controlling their breathing, ignoring the insects already finding exposed skin, mapping the sounds of the jungle around them, and cataloging each one as natural or potentially hostile. Only when the team leader was satisfied as anyone could be in such circumstances, did they begin to move. Their navigation was precise to a degree that infantry units never achieved. Every step was plotted in advance, every checkpoint identified, every contingency considered. They carried maps marked with escape routes, rally points, and pre-planned artillery targets they could call without taking time to calculate coordinates. Preparation was survival. The men who failed to prepare didn't last long. This was the moment that separated LURPs from every other soldier in Vietnam. Regular infantry operated with artillery support, medevac helicopters, quick reaction forces ready to respond. LURPs operated alone. Their radio contact was limited to twice-daily aircraft relays, brief windows when a plane flew high enough overhead to receive their whispered transmissions. Between those windows, they were ghosts. If they encountered the enemy, they could not call for help. If someone was wounded, they could not call for extraction. They moved, watched, and survived entirely on their own resources. The jungle itself was an adversary. Under triple canopy, darkness came absolute, so complete that men groped forward like blind people, navigating by compass alone, the instrument's dial casting a faint green glow on trembling hands. Every step had to be placed deliberately. A snapped twig could betray your position. A scattered pebble could end your life. Teams moved so slowly that progress was measured in minutes of survival rather than meters of ground covered. The pain of staying motionless for hours, muscles cramping, insects biting, became simply another condition of existence. They learned the sounds of the jungle, which bird calls were natural and which were signals, how rain changed the acoustic landscape, what silence meant when it shouldn't be silent. They learned the smell of enemy soldiers, the distinctive scent of rice paddies and fish sauce that clung to NVA uniforms, the smoke from their cooking fires, the decay of bodies hastily buried. They learned to read trails the way hunters read tracks, identifying fresh footprints, estimating how many men had passed and when. And sometimes, despite all their skill, they walked straight into the enemy. The contacts happened at distances measured in feet, not yards. Two groups of men moving through the same jungle, neither aware of the other until suddenly they were face to face. A LURP team member once described the moment of contact as the loudest silence you'll ever hear. That fraction of a second when every man freezes, when eyes lock across the undergrowth. When the first person to react determines who walks away. The moment of mutual recognition, that frozen instant when both sides realized what was happening, lasted perhaps a second. Then everyone was shooting. The sound of a firefight in close jungle was different from combat in open terrain. Weapons fired from 15 feet away hit with concussive force that disoriented even the shooter. Muzzle flashes burned after images into eyes adapted to gloom. The smell of cordite mixed with disturbed vegetation and, within seconds, the copper scent of blood. Men fired at movement, at sound, at anything that might be enemy, while trying desperately not to hit their own teammates in the chaos. LURP doctrine was simple: break contact immediately. A four-man team could not win a sustained firefight against a company-sized element. Their only advantage was surprise and mobility. They would pour fire into the enemy, then run, sometimes together, sometimes scattering to pre-designated rally points while calling for extraction. The sprint through the jungle that followed was a nightmare of branches whipping faces, roots catching ankles, bullets snapping through leaves from behind. Men ran until their lungs burned and their legs gave out, then ran farther. The wait for helicopters was the worst part. Huddled in whatever cover they could find, firing at anything that moved, listening to the radio and hearing nothing, watching their ammunition diminish round by round. Sometimes the extraction came in minutes, sometimes it took hours, sometimes it didn't come at all. The radio conversations during these waits were exercises in controlled desperation. Teams reported their situation in clipped professional language. Heavy contact. request immediate extraction, while bullets snapped overhead and grenades thumped nearby. Sometimes the response was that aircraft were inbound. Sometimes the response was that the landing zone was too hot, that pilots wouldn't attempt it until suppressive fire reduced the threat. Sometimes there was no response at all, just static, the relay aircraft already out of range. In those moments, the decision was stark. Fight until help arrived, or fight until ammunition ran out. There was no third option. A team from the 2nd Brigade, 4th Infantry Division, operated for nearly 20 hours under intermittent contact before finally reaching extraction. They had started with 400 rounds of ammunition between them. They ended with 37. Every man was wounded. The helicopter crew that pulled them out counted 47 bullet holes in the aircraft before they stopped counting. The enemy these men faced was not what American propaganda suggested. North Vietnamese Army regulars were trained, disciplined, and determined professionals. They carried Soviet and Chinese weapons, followed coherent tactical doctrine, and operated from sanctuaries across the border in Cambodia and Laos, where American forces couldn't legally pursue. Their orders invariably included provisions for evacuating their own dead and wounded, a fanatical commitment that meant LRRPs rarely found bodies after firefights. The enemy simply disappeared, carrying their casualties with them, ready to fight again tomorrow. There was a strange respect that sometimes developed between professionals on opposing sides. LRRP teams occasionally passed NVA patrols without either group firing. Both understood what would happen if shooting started. Neither side would escape without losses. In those silent encounters, men who would try to kill each other on any other day simply kept moving, acknowledging with their restraint that they were all just soldiers doing a job. But the moments of mutual recognition were exceptions. The normal pattern was violence, sudden, close, and terrifying. Men found themselves shooting at faces they could see clearly, close enough to watch expressions change in the instant before death. They learned what human bodies looked like when high-velocity rounds struck them. They learned how quickly someone you were talking to could become a corpse. They learned things about themselves that couldn't be unlearned. The weapons they carried sometimes failed them. The M16 rifle, standard issue for American forces, had a catastrophic reliability problem in Vietnam's humid climate. The Army knew. Colt knew. Congressional investigations would later reveal that men had died because bureaucratic politics prevented acknowledgement of the flaw. LRRP teams found their rifles jamming at the worst possible moments. The bolt frozen, the chamber fouled, the weapon useless in their hands, while enemy soldiers closed the distance. Some men were found dead with their rifles disassembled beside them, killed while trying to clear malfunctions they couldn't fix in time. Those who survived long enough learned to adapt. They cleaned their weapons obsessively, sometimes 3 or 4 times a day. They experimented with different ammunition loads, different lubrication techniques, different modifications that might give them an edge. They scrounged carbines from supply sergeants who weren't supposed to have them, trading the M16's theoretical hitting power for weapons that actually worked when you needed them. The helicopter crews who supported LRRP operations developed their own culture of courage. Extraction pilots flew into landing zones that were, by any reasonable assessment, impossible. They hovered while door gunners poured fire into tree lines, holding position while wounded men were pulled aboard, taking hits that should have brought them down but somehow didn't. On February 16, 1967, 16 helicopters were shot down in a single day of operations, a record that stood for the remainder of the war. The pilots who survived kept flying. When LRRP teams called for support, they could summon the full weight of American firepower. Artillery batteries stood ready to drop rounds on coordinates relayed by whispered radio calls. B-52 bombers flew so high they were invisible, their bombs arriving without warning to reshape the landscape below. Gunships circled overhead, their miniguns capable of putting a bullet into every square foot of a football field in a single pass. The AC-47, nicknamed Puff the Magic Dragon, could create a solid column of fire from sky to ground, 6,000 rounds per minute, pouring from each of its weapons. But calling in support meant revealing your position. It meant trusting that coordinates transmitted under fire by men who had been running for their lives would be accurate enough to hit the enemy and not the team. Friendly fire killed soldiers in Vietnam with terrible regularity. The mathematics of artillery, the inherent dispersion of rounds, the margin of error at extreme range, the chaos of combat communication meant that safety was never guaranteed. Men learned to love and fear American firepower in equal measure. The physical toll accumulated invisibly. Leech bites that wouldn't heal, their edges remaining tender and inflamed for months. Intestinal parasites from contaminated water, fungal infections that spread through tropical humidity, malaria that the suppression pills could only delay, waiting to surface once the medication stopped. Men returned from missions with their bodies already beginning to break down, the damage too subtle to recognize until years later. The psychological toll was harder to measure. LURPs operated in a state of constant vigilance that human nervous systems weren't designed to sustain. They learned to function on fragmentary sleep, never fully unconscious, always listening. They learned to suppress fear to a level where it became background noise, always present but manageable. They learned to kill efficiently, without hesitation, because hesitation meant death. And then they went home. The transition was impossibly abrupt. One day a man was running through jungle with bullets chasing him, and within 72 hours he could be standing in an American airport surrounded by civilians who had never heard a shot fired in anger. The compression was disorienting, like surfacing too fast from deep water. The body adapted faster than the mind. The skills that had kept them alive, the constant scanning for threat, the instant calculation of cover and concealment, the readiness to respond with immediate violence, didn't switch off because the environment changed. The men who rotated out of Vietnam found themselves in a country that didn't want to hear what they had experienced. Protesters called them murderers. Civilians turned away in airports. Strangers who noticed the tan line where a watchband had been, or the particular watchfulness in their eyes, sometimes asked questions and then clearly wished they hadn't when answers began. The war had become controversial, and the warriors had become symbols of something their countrymen wanted to forget. Some LURP veterans found that they couldn't explain what they had done, even to people who wanted to understand. How do you describe the sound of silence in the jungle when silence meant danger? How do you convey the bond with men you would die for without hesitation, when the person you're talking to has never depended on anyone that completely? How do you admit the things you did, the things you saw, the things you felt, when those admissions mark you as fundamentally different from everyone who stayed home? The skills that had kept them alive in the jungle, the hypervigilance, the instant aggression, the emotional shutdown became liabilities in a world that demanded different behaviors. Some adapted, most struggled. Nearly all carried their experiences in silence, unable to explain what they had seen and done to people who had no framework for understanding it. The institutional legacy of the LURPs transformed American military doctrine. What began as improvised brigade-level platoons became the template for corps-level reconnaissance operations. The provisional units were formalized, redesignated, and eventually absorbed into the Ranger Regiment. The techniques they developed through trial and fatal error became the foundation of modern special operations reconnaissance. Every major engagement the 4th Infantry Division fought during this period was initiated by LURP intelligence, small teams finding the enemy so that larger forces could destroy them. The tactical innovations were profound. LURP teams proved that small unit operations could achieve strategic effects, that 4 men in the right place could matter more than a battalion in the wrong one. They demonstrated that volunteers, properly motivated and led, could perform missions that doctrine said required elite special operations forces. They showed that courage could compensate for resources, that determination could substitute for training, that heart mattered more than hardware. These lessons echoed forward through decades of American military operations. The long-range surveillance units that descended from Vietnam-era LURPs served until 2018, when the last of them were finally deactivated. The special operations community absorbed their techniques, their ethos, their willingness to accept missions that conventional forces refused. Every reconnaissance soldier who operates behind enemy lines today inherits a legacy written in the Central Highlands half a century ago. But the human cost cannot be measured in tactical outcomes. The men who served in these units paid prices that lasted decades. They carried memories of friends who didn't make it back, of decisions made in seconds that haunted them for years, of experiences that set them apart from everyone who hadn't been there. Some found peace, others never did. The wall in Washington lists over 58,000 names, Americans who died in Vietnam. Among them are LURPs who were killed in action, whose bodies were recovered, whose service was officially documented. Not listed are the men who died later, from wounds that took years to kill them, from diseases contracted in the jungle, from the accumulated damage of missions that didn't officially exist. Not listed are the men who survived physically but lost something essential in the process. They went where no one else would go. They did what no one else could do. They were 4 men against an army, and they held the line. Somewhere in the Central Highlands, in valleys that have grown over with new jungle, the ground still holds the traces of their passing. Shell casings buried in mud, equipment lost in firefights, the places where men fell and were carried out, or fell and were left behind. The jungle doesn't remember, but the survivors do. They remember the names of teammates who didn't make it back. They remember the exact moment when a friend became a casualty, when a firefight became a catastrophe, when the helicopter lifted off with one fewer man than it had dropped. They carry these memories the way they once carried ammunition, as essential equipment, as weight that cannot be set down. That helicopter half a mile out, the one those 4 men heard in the darkness, it came for them. The pilot flew straight into the landing zone despite tracers reaching up from the tree line. The door gunner was still firing when the last man grabbed the skids. They lifted off with bullets punching through the floor, and they made it home. This time, they made it home. The next team, on the next mission, in the next valley, they would need the same courage, the same skill, the same luck. The war demanded it. The LURPs answered. 1 syllable, spoken quickly. The word that meant death to some and survival to others. The men who earned the right to use it never forgot what it cost them.